I'm Mark Crispin Miller. Welcome to tonight's event. This is the beginning of a new series of events. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been hosting monthly authors' chats at this bookstore, a series called First Tuesdays. The purpose of the series was to give a forum to authors whose books have been or are likely to be either unfairly ignored or unfairly attacked. Sarah McNally has been kind enough, because that series was quite successful, and I guess perceptive enough, to suggest that we expand the monthly talks by single authors into a series of monthly panels, which will continue to deal with important subjects that are, unjustly neglected. The name of this series is News from Underground, and this is the first such event. Before I continue, I want to introduce Matt from Truthout, because Truthout.com is going to be co-sponsoring these panels with the bookstore, and will be helping publicize them, and the videos of these events will be available online. So, Matt? Maybe.
Is this one working? Hey, everybody. My name is Matt Renner. I'm the Director of Development and Communications at truthout.org. Truthout, for those of you who don't know, is an online news and information hub. We do, we like to hope that we do transformative political analysis and bring an alternative view to a landscape that is often dominated, especially in these seasons, with partisanship and unfair or biased analysis. I want to thank our hosts here at McNally Jackson for this beautiful space and this inspiring and hopeful bookstore. It's beautiful to see you all here tonight and all these amazing panelists. I'm just honored, and Truthout is honored to be working with Mark Crispin Miller. And I'll be around afterwards if any of you want to talk more about Truthout. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Hold the applause. I'm going to introduce our panel tonight. The subject is the Christianist Infiltration of America's Public Schools, an extremely alarming problem that doesn't get much attention at all. So we thought it would be appropriate to kick off our series with a panel devoted to it. And the occasion for this panel is a new book by Katherine Stewart, The Good News Club, which I just finished reading, and it took a few years off my life. It's extremely frightening and riveting, a really first-class piece of investigative journalism that I urge you all to buy and read after this event. Katherine's going to be followed by Kathryn Joyce, who's the author of Quiverfull, Inside the Christian Patriarchy Movement. Katherine actually came and spoke at the bookstore when that book came out. It was a great event, and we're very pleased to have her back. We're extremely fortunate to have Frank Schaeffer with us tonight. He has been here before as well. He's the author of the indispensable memoir, Crazy for God. He's got a new book out called Sex, Mom, and God, which is about the right-wing sex obsession. That's inaccurate, yes. And finally, my friend and colleague, Jonathan Zimmerman, my colleague at NYU. He is the author of a book called Small Wonder, which is a sort of history of the notion of the Little Red Schoolhouse that was published in the Yale series Icons of America, which I was editing at the time. So it's a little bit incestuous, I suppose, this event, but I think in a good way, if incest can be good. So each of us, something we could actually discuss if you want to kick that around. Each of us will, each of the panelists, that is, will speak for about 10 minutes in order to leave time for a lively Q&A. Okay? So first, join me in welcoming Katherine Stewart.
Should I stand right here?
You stand wherever you want.
Thank you so much for coming. It's is this too loud, or is this just right? Okay, great. And it's such a pleasure to be here in this fantastic bookstore. I'm going to talk to you today about a range of initiatives, many of them under the radar, taken by the religious right to infiltrate and undermine our public schools. In my research, I was surprised to see over and over again that one of the distinguishing features of these programs, and one of the reasons why they don't attract the attention that they should, is that they rely on deceit. Simply put, many of these so-called Bible study clubs and other initiatives are not what they appear to be. They have an agenda far more sweeping and potentially threatening to public education than they let on. And the biggest factor driving the insertion of religion into public schools is judicial activism from the right. I know that these are bold claims. Some people will say they're alarmist. I have learned firsthand that they aren't. 3 years ago, when my family was living in Santa Barbara, California, I learned that an after-school group calling itself the Good News Club was coming to our daughter's public school. The program describes itself as Bible study from a non-denominational perspective. And my first thought was, what could be wrong with that? The group required parental permission to join. So I figured, let the kids whose parents want them to learn about the Bible sign them up. But then I started hearing stories from parents around town whose kids went to schools where Good News Clubs had recently been established. And I began to realize that Good News Clubs are less concerned with studying the Bible than with turning kids into faith-based bullies. Let me tell you about Zoe. She was on the playground when a 6-year-old classmate, who I'll call Ashley, said to her, "You're going to hell because you don't believe in Jesus." Zoe objected, saying, "That's not true." And the children's teacher, overhearing the exchange, decided to use this as a teachable moment. Different religions, she explained, have different perspectives on different issues. Now, Zoe was fine with that. But Ashley, the girl who was attending a Good News Club, she was devastated. How can that be? She burst into tears. "I know it must be true because I learned it in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true. How can they lie to us in school?" This story gets to the heart of the trouble with the Good News Club. I don't have a problem with kids having religious discussions, expressing their faith at school, or even proselytizing, but I do have a problem with Ashley believing that her particular beliefs are coming from the school. That perception on Ashley's part was no accident. It soon became obvious to me that the main purpose of the Good News Club is to deceive small children into believing that their particular religious creed is sanctioned by and has the support of their public school. An equally important goal of the club is to pressure kids to try to recruit their non-participating peers. At every the Good News Clubs are sponsored by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. And at every Child Evangelism Fellowship training that I attended, kids were instructed to tell their friends that there is only one way to get to heaven. And they were often given points or prizes for recruiting their peers to the club. So who's behind these Good News Clubs? I decided to investigate and spent 3 years researching this and similar initiatives in public schools. What did I find out? The CEF has a very specific and deeply fundamentalist agenda. They are represented at their national conventions by extremists who rail against the so-called homosexual agenda, support creationism in public schools, seek to undermine women's reproductive freedom, and condemn interfaith marriage, referred to by one keynote speaker as interracial marriage. They also believe that most people who call themselves Christians, such as Roman Catholics, United Methodists, U.S. Episcopalians, and others, really are not Christian at all. I was surprised to learn that there are 3,500, that's 3,500 Good News Clubs in public elementary schools around the country. Their presence in public schools has grown 728% over the last 10 years. Their numbers double every 2 to 3 years. If they continue to grow at this rate, they will reach their goal of placing a Good News Club in every public elementary school within the next 2 decades. I also learned that religious initiatives in public schools are not just limited to the Good News Clubs. The issue is much broader and deeper. I'm going to tell you about another one. A year and a half ago, my husband and I moved to New York City, enrolled our children in a public school across the street. One Sunday, just after the school began, I looked out my window and saw a group of people gathered in front of the schoolhouse door. They had brochures, a tray of lollipops, and a 4-foot-tall sign. It turned out that they were part of an evangelical ministry and that our school was their church. So I decided to attend the service at the church at our school. Notice the names of children on pieces of paper, the pastor advised his flock. I looked around and saw the posters my children's schoolmates had made. Pray for them, the pastor continued. Pray that the families of this school will come to know Jesus and say, this is a house of God. After the service, I chatted with the pastor and asked him how much it cost to rent the school. Oh no, he said, we don't pay rent. Ours was just one of 160 New York City schools that have doubled as rent-free houses of worship. The vast majority of them evangelical Christian churches in their off hours. Thanks to a 2001 Supreme Court decision that I'll discuss more in a moment, churches were now able to plant themselves without paying for rent or utilities in public schools across the city, bypassing pre-existing laws that barred partisan political groups, as well as worship services, from using public schools. I attended services at dozens of these churches. In public school classrooms, I learned about creationism. In a public school library, I was told to pray for the glorious day that America would be brought under Christian dominion, American government, education, law, media, and finance. At a church in the village, I heard a congregant praise the anti-gay ministry that is affiliated with the church planted at that school. Most of the school churches I attended were not spontaneous eruptions of faith from the community. They were the project instead of national and international church planting organizations, largely conservative evangelical religious networks that realized they could use a state subsidy to open up a branch office. In each neighborhood's best piece of real estate, the public schools, where the kids are, that's your tax dollars at work. In the course of researching my book, I discovered that church planting and good news clubs were not the only religious initiatives in public schools. Enormous resources are being devoted to something called peer evangelism, that is, getting kids to try to convert their peers. Now, to reiterate, I support the right of children to talk about their religion with their friends at school. But many of the peer evangelism efforts I personally witnessed can't really be defined as student-led. For instance, last fall, I participated in an annual prayer event that takes place on thousands of America's public school campuses called See You at the Pole. Now, it's well established that children are allowed to pray in school, and the legal understanding is that as long as they lead the prayers themselves and it doesn't disrupt the school day, it's perfectly acceptable. And I agree that with such conditions in place, it should be. But it turns out that even though the prayers themselves were led by students, the event simply would not have been the spectacle that it was without adult involvement. Adults were heavily involved in every step of the process, beginning with the national coordination effort. The idea that it's okay as long as the kids do it is now so pervasive among those who view the public schools as missionary fields that leaders of religious advocacy groups are publishing books with titles like Reclaim Your School, 10 Steps to Legally and Practically Evangelize Your Public School. Sorry. Let me get this. 10 Steps to Legally and Practically Evangelize Your Public School. Their ideas include organizing on-campus revival rallies, turning oral reports into opportunities for kids to evangelize their peers, and student-led prayers at school-wide assemblies. Here's another example. The Lifebook movement is a project of the Gideons International, which has attempted to distribute Bibles onto public school campuses for years, with mixed success. But they've hit the jackpot with the peer evangelism exception. The Lifebook movement gets kids to distribute evangelical books written with teens in mind to other kids in school. Using kids to do what grown-ups are not allowed to do is a God-given loophole, in the words of a Lifebook movement leader. It brilliantly threads a separation of church and state loophole. In just 2.5 years, the Lifebook movement has distributed about 2 million of these evangelical books on public school campuses, just 2.5 years. Student athletics also provides the religious right with opportunities for peer evangelism in public schools. The Fellowship for Christian Athletes instructs children on how to pray before, during, and after their school sports activities. Over the past 20 years, the Fellowship for Christian Athletes has grown from having 100,000 students involved in its programs to reaching nearly 1.8 million children. Membership in such groups is technically optional, but other groups bring character education into the school as a cover for religious proselytizing inside the school, and all children are required to participate. Team Impact, Commandos USA, the Power Team, the Strength Team, these are just a few of the faith-based groups that come into the public schools with programs on drug addiction, drunk driving, and other important topics, and aim to leave with a collection of young religious converts. This brings me to the main point I want to bring to your attention: judicial activism from the right. What do all of these initiatives have in common? They have strong backing and support from the Christian legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defense Fund, Liberty Counsel, the ACLJ, and the Pacific Justice Institute. You may never have heard of some of these organizations, but they have combined budgets of over $100 million per year. These legal groups are determined to turn America into a so-called Christian nation, and they have public schools in their sights. The other thing they have in common is the Supreme Court. A large part of the religious activity in public schools today is due to a 2001 Supreme Court decision, Good News Club versus Milford Central School, in which the Supreme Court appeared to suggest that keeping religious groups out of the schools was a violation of their free speech rights. The court held that religion is nothing more than speech from a certain point of view, and therefore all religious activities are protected by the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment. The court pushed free speech so far that the Establishment Clause, which prohibits government endorsing or funding of an establishment of religion, has been eviscerated. They've used the distinction between school-sponsored speech and student speech as a kind of loophole. The Supreme Court opened the doors, and now programs like the Good News Club are turning public schools into mission fields. In conclusion, there isn't much doubt that the separation of church and state is being undermined here. These multiple initiatives are breaches of the spirit of constitutional law, if not the letter. But more important than these individual breaches is the ongoing and largely successful project of undermining public education. All these religious initiatives, aggressively pursued, will chip away at the credibility and standing of the public school system. It's an illustration of why the separation of church and state is not just a matter of protecting individual rights. Separation of church and state is not just a luxury of our system of government. It is a foundation of it. Thanks so much.
Okay, Kathryn Joyce.
Thank you. When I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about here today, I started thinking about a little bit of an issue I faced with my own book, Quiverfull, and the sense that I encountered that some of the goals of the religious right, of the Christian right in this country, can seem too bombastic to be taken seriously. If you talk about Christian groups wanting to indoctrinate your children, that can sound like overkill until you go to the meetings that Katherine has gone to and you've listened to them lay out plans like the 4-14 window, which is you're going to get to these children between 4 and 14. This is the most prime opportunity for evangelism that you have, and you're going to be going after, implicitly other people's children. I want to talk most about Katherine's book, but I want to go a little bit into the reason why this is so compelling for me is what I reported on in Quiverfull, which, for those of you who don't know, is a Christian right movement that believes that contraception is antithetical to being a good Christian. So women need to open their wombs up to have as many children as God gives them, and they end up having families of 10, 14, or in one famous televised case, 19 children. Along with this goes a subscription to extremely patriarchal ideas, the idea that feminism is also deeply incompatible with Christianity, and the idea that you have to bring your daughters especially, but all of your children up to replicate this way of living so that it continues on and you have generations of children following in the ideals of these original patriarchs. So because of that, I guess I have a sense of reading many of these books and talking to many of these people about just how seriously they take the project of shaping children. And so what I think Kathryn's done here, to me, is just fantastic, is, looking at the other side of this coin. The families that I talked to were, for the most part, not involved in public schools. They were, deeply separatist homeschoolers. However, even among those homeschoolers, but also on the other side of the Christian right that engages more to some extent with popular culture, there is this idea that you're going to kind of join and engage in some sense while seeking to undermine the entire project. And you have some incredible quotes in your book from people talking about how they want to sink the ship of public education, which is also language that I came across in my reporting. People are talking about wanting to destroy the public school system through attrition. So I guess I was going to pull out a few things that you wrote about that deeply struck me. The 414 window was the most blatantly I'd ever heard that put, that this idea that getting at the hearts and minds, as it were, of children is the best chance for winning a long-term culture war. The book, for me, it gets at this basic understanding of what conservative religious activists say. In Quiverfull, they say often that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. But in this formulation, one of your subjects, your sources, said the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation is going to be the philosophy of government in the next. And so I think they're really taking seriously the project of shaping children's minds to be evangelists, to be evangelicals who are going to, through kind of a trickle-up process, bring their own families along. I thought it was fantastic. You lay out this, to me, very cynical program of how evangelical adults are luring kids into these clubs with pizza, after-school pizza parties and candy and games. To me, I can't think of something that is kind of more barefaced appeal to hungry kids after school. But especially your demonstration of using kids to evangelize other kids, using these children as agents of transformation for their kids and then for their families, who they're hoping, if they get their kids involved enough in these good news clubs, that their families are eventually going to come along to church one day. There is this just smirking attitude I detected in a lot of the sources towards rules that limit proselytizing children, and many, many loopholes that they are actively investigating and exploiting to get around regulations that are supposed to make schools, fairly neutral grounds where children of diverse upbringings can go to learn things that we've all agreed on. What was also particularly impressive to me is the way you delved into how these efforts are disguised as student initiatives, because I think that's a key thing that happens again and again in a lot of religious right movements. See You at the Poll is one that you recognized, and I Googled it today to make sure I got the name right. And for those of you who haven't seen this is not, you can look at the website and know this is not a child-led initiative. This is a very the program intensive website that's been designed with an awful lot of money to promote something that is on its face, being presented as a grassroots movement of, bullied evangelical students gathering at the flagpole in the morning on one day a year. It's just not the way it is. This is a highly financed movement. Something else that's in the same vein is the Day of Silence, I believe it's called. This is a counter to Pride Days in schools, where Christian students who do not support gay rights or the tolerance of LGBT in any way will have a day of silence on, the Pride Day to register, their disapproval. A lot of them sometimes have worn very offensive T-shirts with offensive biblical scriptures, saying various things. And this is, again, another adult-led initiative. And now the Good News Club, to me, fits exactly into that pattern. I also thought, reading this, that the skirting of regulations is a much larger effort. Just the overall attempt to skate by on the impression that they are being, a proper part of school business. At the same time, they are talking amongst themselves about wanting to sink the ship. They want to kick down the doors of public education, or they're describing schools that are being transformed into churches as beachheads. There's this very militaristic language that you will see in a lot of Christian right movements, certainly in Quiverfull, where they spoke of the many children they're having as arrows of war, arrows that are going to go out and engage the enemy in, culture and spiritual war. Now we're seeing this language again in the way people are describing these schools. Beachheads. I mean, a beachhead is how you start a war. There's also, I think, something that we all probably recognize at this point, but bears repeating, that the presentation of these aggressive efforts and this very aggressive militaristic language comes at the same time that there is a call for everybody else to express tolerance for this, that everybody else needs to be tolerant of efforts to evangelize your children out of whatever religion or lack of religion you practice at home, about the right of these clubs to take part in school activities that are being underwritten with taxpayer funding, and of churches to set up shop in taxpayer-funded schools. I think everybody is expected to tolerate this as a principle of religious freedom and liberty, and that's what's going to court cases, is exactly those principles. Another just few things that you should all look for in the book that are, I think an amazing just result of your investigation and research, just understanding the machinery of large-scale evangelizing operations and some of the things you found out about how numbers-focused they are, about how much like a pyramid scheme some of these organizations seem, with franchises built up around the country, and people who are setting up the Good News Clubs, I hope I'm getting this right, expected to kick back $20,000 a year to the main organization, which is obviously how they are funding tremendous expansion. I just think that's incredible. Also, a wonderful pickup of subtler tensions in the movement, how these Good News Clubs are going to give a light touch when they are proselytizing Catholic families, so the children won't run home and say something that's going to tip off their parents to the fact that people at school are saying that your religion is idolatrous and, you're all going to hell. So they're giving a really soft touch there. And also the cynicism in how they discuss how they're going to appeal to lower-income families because their children are more likely to be left unsupervised after school. I find these stunning admissions for them to actually be making. And, now that they're out, I hope that gets picked up, because that should be something that's offensive to people of any sort of belief. The church planting in New York, I think, couldn't be more timely. This is erupting into a big issue here with, their stated plans to turn every New York public school into a church within the next several of years. Again, something that is being presented as an issue of religious freedom and religious tolerance. So I think you demonstrate well with personal stories how the fallout in communities from these sorts of, divisions that are intentionally courted by Good News Clubs and the rest of them can be very serious. Parents coming to great odds over what's being portrayed as a situation of religious liberty and respect for other people's religious beliefs, and community disintegrates. Parents are fighting with each other, and everything that is supported by parents being involved in a supportive school system ends up suffering for that. And just a last note on one of the last chapters, because you covered so much, but on the revision of textbooks, which is another big issue that everybody should be paying attention to. It reminded me again of one of my big Quiverfull subjects, who was the publisher of a homeschooling curriculum, and, you know, quite a culture warrior on top of that, named Doug Phillips. And he liked to repeat a phrase constantly, that he who tells the story controls the culture. And I think this is one of the instances in which, you know, these people are right. That when you do control the stories that children are told from this early age, you are controlling, you know, the context of their education and what they're going to believe in a lot of ways. And when you have people, you know, actively organizing to present ahistorical arguments, that's going to shape the way future generations approach all of these issues. And when you have people replacing, you know, nationally recognized figures like Martin Luther King with, you know, all of the lesser lights of Reagan's administration, that's something that's really going to show itself in about 20 years. So congratulations. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
I'm sitting here with Katherine. I'm thinking of renaming myself Katherine as well, so you won't get confused. I'd like to talk tonight about the issue in a slightly broader context than Katherine and Katherine, who have done fantastic work on the specifics of what we've come here tonight to talk about. I'm going to spend a tiny bit of my time on my biography because it's apropos of this situation. We would not be here tonight talking about this if it had not been for the work of my father and myself and our colleagues in the 70s and 80s. In the book I have here tonight, Sex, Mom, and God, it's the third of a trilogy of memoir, the first being Crazy for God, the second Patience with God, the third Sex, Mom, and God. And through those books, and particularly the last one I hear here tonight, I trace a family history, that being the history of my family, the Schaeffer family, as it overlapped with the rise of the religious right in the United States, this attempt at theocracy, which is what we're facing now, how our family played a part, and why I got out after my father died in 1984, having been groomed to become his sidekick, because the way the evangelical world works is similar to North Korea. We may not inherit the call ourselves, but we do inherit the mailing list, and it's very valuable. And if you have been homeschooled, as I was, bred from childhood, as you were talking about, between those ages of 4 and 14, as you mentioned in your book, by the time you're 17 or 18, you know no other world. So I have lived on the inside of this and escaped. I'm the product of the education they talk about in terms of being sheltered from the world. And then if you are the son of a well-known evangelical leader, as my father was, and you go out and speak because your name is Schaeffer as well, and when they can't get him, they get you, pretty soon you're 22, 23 years old, and you are talking to the Southern Baptist Convention, as I was as their keynote speaker one year, 23,000 pastors, more people than in this room. The keynote speaker at the National Religious Broadcaster, sharing the stage with Ronald Reagan. At that time, you're sitting down with the Bush family, Barbara Bush, who came regularly to my parents' ministry, with Jack Kemp in his living room, talking about how to take our agenda and turn it into an agenda that would put the Republican Party as the dominant party for the next 50 to 100 years, literally discussions like that. So that's the world I grew up in. That's what I describe in Sex, Mom, and God. And I talk about really where all this came from. I left and went off to Hollywood, having made 30 hours of documentaries for my father and Dr. C. Everett Koop, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, here in New York City, visiting with Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who took me into his private chapel, knelt me down on a little red velvet stool, put his hands on my head, and said, "You are the cavalry." Because up until this moment, the pro-life issue was Roman Catholic. Now with the Schaeffers added, and you have brought other people like James Dobson that we talked into the movement, Jerry Falwell, who before that just wanted to save people for Jesus. Because you all have arrived, now we can expand this. And we got the first notion of that when we were shooting Whatever Happened to the Human Race up the street here with Dr. C. Everett Koop in the big graveyard. We're denied permission to go shoot there because Francis Ford Coppola had shot the Godfather funeral scene there, and a lot of people whose graves showed up, their grandmothers called and said, you know, they were insulted. And so the answer was no, and I called Fulton Sheen, and within 10 minutes we had permission. So from then on, even though officially, according to our theology, Catholics were the whore of Babylon and would go to hell, when it came to cooperation on these political issues, we were one and the same. And where all the crossroads came together was the anti-abortion movement. The template of the anti-abortion movement was to delegitimize the United States government because it allowed abortion, and it succeeded. And it has been used ever since by, for instance, the Koch brothers and the Wall Street bankers and others who have no interest in these issues whatsoever, but are very glad to have a group of white, mostly undereducated or uneducated people who believe that anything the US government does, like public education, is by default bad because the US government is now the enemy of God because it has allowed gay rights, it has allowed abortion, it's allowed women to get out of the house and have careers, it's allowed them to do all these things which the Bronze Age mythology of the scriptures don't allow. And so what we really face in America is not a peculiarly American situation. We are simply part of a much larger picture, and that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about in this moment here. I think right now, our moment of history, we're seeing a global confrontation between science, modernity, humanism, the fruits of the Enlightenment, if you like, and fundamentalist religion of all kinds. So whether it's people strapping on suicide belts, or whether it's people taking their kids out of the public schools because they regard them as illegitimate because they are government-run, or whether it's people following the programs that you've been talking about, and that is sending their kids into schools as warriors, not because they care about education, but they care about undermining the actual structure of the public education system, which is the goal because they don't regard it as legitimate. They are really our Taliban. They are our Al-Qaeda. They are our Iranian mullahs. And so this is not a peculiar American situation with roots back into the Puritan Bay State colony. This is the American manifestation of a global confrontation of frightened fundamentalists who are watching their power, their witchcraft, if you like, their ability to convince slip away with the advent of science, humanism, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. It is a reaction. Most of the people in it would not put it in those terms, but that's where we are. So the American manifestation of this is now political. And just to give credence to what you heard before I talk here tonight, if you don't believe what they were saying in terms of the actual plotting, the conspiratorial nature of what's going on, you only have to realize that these are the same folks that sat down on Fox News and have repeatedly told lies about President Obama, that he wasn't born here, that he's a Muslim and or a communist or a socialist, or take your pick, even though these things are contradictory. And so what you have here is a movement that is not about education, it's not even about evangelism. It is a revolutionary movement that is about the overthrow of secularism per se, period. So whether they're fighting gay rights or whether they're trying to proselytize in schools, when I grew up, before my parents got into politics, the agenda really was bringing people to Jesus. Now, whether you agreed or not, it was not to overthrow the general culture. Today, whether it's the Quiverfull movement, whether it's what's going on in public schools, whether it's what's going on in politics, where Newt Gingrich was sitting down on Meet the Press last Sunday talking about the fact that one of the things he objects to so strongly is that President Obama is anti-Catholic, so they're going to ratchet up that, and you're going to be hearing it from Mitt Romney as well, this pitting of the good religious minority against the big, bad, evil media, academic community, whatever. These things take different forms, but the underlying battle is one between what they regard their legitimate call by God to establish what would be the American version of an Iranian theocracy here,
and their version of a completely illegitimate series of enemies, which they would call secular humanists or liberals or Democrats or whatever it might be, or Barack Obama, or whoever, fill in the blank. And so not every foot soldier in this war is aware of any of this, but the people who sat down in the 70s and 80s, and for instance, in rooms that I was in, and brought together the energy of the opening moves of the pro-life movement and the Republican Party, cynical politicians like Ronald Reagan, who had legalized abortion in California, then flipped when he gave the speech the next day after I talked at the religious broadcasters and said now he was pro-life, et cetera, et cetera. The point I want to make and forcefully here is that this issue is not, I know this sounds strange, it's not about what it's about. So the agenda here is not education. It's not helping people have better education so they can go to good colleges and have careers and meaningful lives and be able to go to the Met today and take a look at that wonderful portrait exhibition of Renaissance portraits, and they will have heard of Botticelli and understand who these people were. It's not that at all. It is exactly the program of the Taliban when they blew up those two big Buddhas. They hate the secular culture. And so the very people who wrap themselves in the flag most in this country and who talk the most about patriotism and values and family values, actually, and I think this is where the liberal media, if you want to use the right-wing term, has totally misunderstood the situation. These are not patriots. They despise the United States as it is. The country they love is a fictional America that probably never existed and certainly doesn't now. It would not have very many immigrants in it of any other color but white. It would certainly not have anybody in it in a position of power who was not a Christian from their point of view, which would exclude many Christian denominations. It would not be inclusive of gay people, certainly not of Jews, unless they were good Jews, quote unquote, who were the kind of Zionists who would go off and settle the West Bank so that Jesus could come back in a hurry. Not the kind of Jews that run the ACLU. Those aren't good Jews. The good Jews are the ones who go back to Israel and help Jesus come back. And of course, he'll have to kill all the Jews when he does, but he'll take the Christians to heaven. So they're doing their job in this apocalyptic scenario. And if you think that's funny, then I invite you to wonder why the 16 novels of Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins on the Left Behind series have sold some 30 million copies together. 60 million copies, that's right. So I just want to conclude my little speech here by saying that what I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God, and what I've been trying to expose in these books I'm writing, is the underlying philosophy of a movement that presents itself in bits and pieces. We just want to teach a Bible class in your school. We would just like to do sex education. We have a thing called the silver ring thing. You just wear this ring and it'll promote chastity. But of course, when Bush gave that silver ring thing, which is what the movement's called, $1.6 million in sex education funds, what they did is turn right around and turn sex education, which was not sex education, it was abstinence education only, into more right-wing, proselytizing, evangelizing school clubs. And that was the actual purpose. But that wasn't even the actual purpose. The real purpose was to undermine the secular world altogether and to infiltrate it with what they would view as religious values and then replace it. And that is exactly the agenda, and that is what's been going on, whether it's the textbook revision, whether it's the school clubs, whether it's the entrance into sex education through abstinence-only programs. All of this stuff only has one final agenda, even if the people involved have no clue what it is. And I'm not talking about some global conspiracy. I'm talking about something much more difficult. And that's like a like-minded set of values. And that is, it's an anti-American, unpatriotic movement that seeks to undermine the United States as a secular democracy. And what it seeks to replace it with is a soft theocracy, which will be divided on the business side, replace the teachings of Jesus Christ with the teachings of Ayn Rand, a libertarianism when it comes to economics, but when it comes to personal morality, whether it's choice or gay rights or how you educate your children, it will have theocratic values that will be imposed, if not by the force of law with public beheadings, but then imposed in the way that the religious right has been imposing them, and that is insidiously through programs that are smokescreen for a completely different agenda than the one that is advertised when they come into your public school. And so I think that's the larger context of what we're talking about here tonight, and it's certainly what I've been trying to write about. Thanks.
Can I ask you to pass those out? Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, but there are some bad things too. It's not all peaches and cream. All right. Yeah. Is anyone really depressed? Yeah. I want to thank Mark Crispin Miller for setting this up and for inviting me. And in exchange for his good works, I'm having him distribute a little illustration. Since I'm a university professor, I can't do anything without some, little handout. There'll also be a quiz at the end. I'm a historian. I study dead people. I am interested in the present, but I'm mostly interested in dead people. And the reason that I am is I think that hopefully it helps us ask some different questions about the present. And that's what I'd like to do right now. I should tell you I'm an enormous admirer of Kathy's book. You'll find a blurb on the back of it from me. It's one of the best things I've read in a long time. I'm going to teach it next semester. But I'd also like to ask her and the other panelists a question that I think history raises, which is the objection here to religious indoctrination in our schools, or is it to the particular religious tradition of the indoctrinators? Those are different things. And here's how I think history can help us frame the question. I wrote a book many years ago called Who's America, in which I thought that when I started doing it, I was going to write this book about this battle between who wanted religion in schools and who didn't. And I found out that was the wrong question. Because before the 1960s, virtually everyone who was Christian wanted religion in schools. But here's the takeaway message. They wanted different versions of Christianity. And the first great wave of religious instruction in school was promoted by liberal and, yes, radical Christians. Okay? It took various forms. In the North, it was called weekday religious education. Some of you may remember this. On Wednesdays at 2 o'clock, I don't know why it was Wednesdays at 2 o'clock, but if you wanted, you'd be dismissed at that time, and you would get religious instruction from a church-paid and church-selected teacher. Occasionally a synagogue-selected and synagogue-paid teacher. Before 1948, this happened in a different room of the building. After 1948, when the court said you couldn't do that, you'd have to go somewhere else. But who was behind this? In the North, it was weekday religious education. In the South, they actually had Bible electives. Again, sponsored, paid for by church organization. Who was behind it? Again, left-wing Christians. This is from North Carolina in 1943. This is a Bible teacher teaching a Bible elective in the public schools. Her name was Louise Bashford. Upon us rests the responsibility of presenting the Prince of Peace. Remember, this is 43. If we fail, we leave students surrounded by the hardness and the cruelty of war that breeds hate, lost in the inequalities of an economic system that begets servants of mammon, slaves within the mental stockades of racial injustice. It's North Carolina. We cannot fail. We must not fail. Ours is a holy task. This is somebody who wants religion in school. Listen, if I say religion in schools, right, you think right wing. Okay? And we've had very good illustrations of why you think that way. But my point is that's a construction of our own time, of our own lifetimes. And it was not the case in prior lifetimes. So here's another North Carolina Bible teacher, same era, the 40s. It's a riff on Luke 18:11, which is the prayer of the modern Pharisee, which is, God, I thank thee, I'm not like other men. And so this guy doing a riff, right, a satire, he says, God, I thank thee, I'm not as other men are. I thank thee that I'm a Southerner and not a Yankee. Thankful, too, that I'm an Occidental and not an Oriental. True, Confucius and Gautama Buddha and Abraham and Moses and Gandhi are great men, but I never liked slanting eyes or the wrong shape of nose. I thank thee that I'm white, not yellow or red or brown or black. The Bible does teach us that while man looketh on the outward appearance, God looketh on the heart, but the outward appearance counts for a lot below the Mason-Dixon line. That's an advocate for religion in schools. Okay? Jesus doesn't know color. Jesus hates war. Jesus hates racial injustice and segregation. Now, the story I told in Who's America was these people would be challenged by, yes, a burgeoning fundamentalist movement that sought to use weekday religious education and these Bible electives to inscribe their version of Christianity, which tonight is being called Christianist. And this happened at the same time. Also in 1943, I got the same year, United Evangelical Action. You'll get a sense of this because it's much more congruent with what you just heard. Religious education on release time may be one of the greatest means of evangelism for the coming generation, or it may be the most destructive to faith. If there is religious education on release time, the questions of the origin of the race, the deity of Christ, the infallibility of the Bible cannot be avoided. The evangelicals of the nation have the responsibility to impress the boards of education with the fact that, and here's the takeaway, so-called Protestantism is divided into two entirely and irrevocably diverse groups. One of the great things about history is every so often they actually say what you want them to say. You actually find it, like you get the get. Right? I didn't make that up. Like, this guy actually wrote that. It's like, oh, thank you. You made my book. Right? Okay, so-called Protestantism is divided into two entirely and irrevocably diverse groups. So basically, what I tell in that book that I wrote, the story that I tell is how these two groups of Christians, or camps, did battle, not over whether religion should be in school. That really wasn't the issue. But what religion, specifically what version of Christianity should be in school. And in the 1960s, what happened? Well, what I think happened is that liberals ceded this question to conservatives, and very conservative conservatives, because they didn't want to erode the court's authority on race. One of the, there was a prayer decision in the 60s and a Bible decision. I go on the radio a lot about subjects like this, and often, people call and they say, and the court said you can't pray in schools, right? This is utter bullshit. The court's never said that. You can pray whenever you want. What the court said, of course, is you can't have state sanctions, right? Teacher-led prayer, but of course, as you've heard, you do. Anyway, liberals, for the most part, got out of this business. One of these decisions came down, actually, while Martin Luther King was getting arrested for the third time in Albany, Georgia. As you may have read, he often prayed while he was getting arrested, and somebody puts a mic in his face while he's getting arrested and says, the Supreme Court just, I forget if it was the prayer or the Bible one, Supreme Court said that you can't have state-led prayer or state-led Bible. What do you think? And he said, we must support the court, for the court is all we have. It's a very tepid endorsement, okay, of the court decision in this case. And what I found when I got into the African-American press is there is this moment in the early 60s where African-Americans are condemning the court on religion, condemning the prayer and Bible decisions. Why? Because the civil rights movement was a religious movement, right? I often begin my undergraduate class in this subject by asking the kids, students, what was Martin Luther King's profession? And I've gotten really interesting answers. I should tell you that one of my best students ever is in the audience, Jordan Milet. I'm delighted that she's here. She didn't say what I'm about to say. But several people said he was a lawyer. But my favorite is he was a policy wonk. I've always loved that. I have a dream that one day, thanks to the earned income tax credit, the poverty rate will drop 0.7%. I have a dream today, my friends. It was a Christian movement. It was a religious movement. So there was a very brief moment where civil rights advocates people on the left condemn the prayer and Bible decisions for taking the Bible out of schools because they need the Bible to argue for racial justice. And you see an example of that in a cartoon here. You see, sorry, this school is segregated. And now, of course, you have Jesus trying to get into the school by some ironclad law of 20th century iconography. Jesus must always look like Greg Ullman. Okay, this seems to be some sort of cultural law. I've spent a little time in the parts of the world where Jesus lived, and except for missionaries and tourists, nobody looks like Greg Ullman. But anyway, here you have Greg Ullman, and that's obviously Earl Warren standing in the schoolhouse door, as it were, like George Wallace. Sorry, the school's segregated. Look, the assumption of the cartoon is segregation is evil, right? Okay. Sorry, this school is segregated. Not only does it keep out white people, but it keeps out Jesus. Well, this is a very, very brief moment. Because like I said, liberals essentially cede this question to conservatives. So within a brief 5 years, if you look at the back, you have illustrations and iconography that will be much more familiar to you, right? Because again, when I say religion in schools, you say right wing. Okay, and here you have it. This didn't come out very well, but on the left you've got the books of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and God, Jefferson, and Lincoln. On the right you've got somebody sweeping the Bible out of the Little Red Schoolhouse, which appeared in my other book. And then I really like the illustration below. You've got the American teacher and the Soviet teacher, right? I think one of the things actually you learn from this illustration is that American teachers are just way hotter than Soviet teachers. I mean, what is she wearing? Is that a kimono? Like, what is that? But you know, as King Lear said, this is not altogether fool, my lord. I guess the jester said that to King Lear. Look, none of this means that I want religious or theological instruction in schools, so that I don't share the concerns of this panel. I absolutely do. But because I'm a historian and my job is to question what I think and what you think, I do wonder how much of our current condemnation really stems from our distrust of and distaste for the particular religion of the particular human beings that are trying to insert themselves into the schools right now. If there was another Louise Bashford in the schools right now trying to teach Christianity so that kids knew that Jesus supports the 99% over the 1%, or that, you know, the U.S. should get out of Afghanistan, would we be objecting so loudly? Would we even be here? Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're going to take questions, I suppose. You must have some if you can get over your shock.
A feeling I have about this. I'm sort of not that religious, a little religious, raised in Iowa, and went to school in the 40s and 50s where religion was only a part of the opening exercises, and then we dropped it. And then that was in grade school, and it was unoffensive, quite honestly. And then in high school, maybe there was a Bible club, and we were invited to attend, but I didn't want to attend. And a couple of my best friends in junior high and high school were Jewish, and I went to the bat mitzvahs. So it was like, and in Cedar Rapids, where I'm from, there was like 2 churches on every corner. But it was part of the whole ambience of the city, which was a very pleasant place to grow up. And, you know, so I'm thinking now that maybe in the schools there's a big vacuum, and that's why the right wing is getting in there, because there is a vacuum.
What kind of a vacuum?
People watching television constantly, the boob tube. You know, it's like a lot of kids don't know any better, anything, and a lot of them maybe don't go to church. So I think the answer is somewhere in between these extremes. You know what I mean? And there's a question implicit in that.
Okay. Would you who wants to, Frank, who would like to talk to the question of whether or not this phenomenon we're discussing is a response to a pervasive sense of emptiness among young people? Would you?
Maybe.
Well.
I don't even. Go ahead.
I think Frank could speak to the larger agenda here.
Okay, well, I want to follow up. Well, they're asking me to speak up for the camera here. Sorry. One of the things that you have to understand about the panel here, I can't speak for anybody else on this panel. I am religious. I go to church every Sunday. I go to a Greek Orthodox church because I like Byzantine liturgy. There are no sermons. Most of it's in Greek, so I can't understand it, which suits me fine, because it's a contact with a sense of transcendence and mystery that I don't find somewhere else, and it's part of my tradition to be in church. So anybody that's reading any of my books is not going to walk away thinking that they have read Christopher Hitchens' Younger, Dumber Brother, because that's not my point of view. For instance, right now I'm part of a festival that will be meeting again down in North Carolina this summer called the Wild Goose Festival, which is made up of a lot of people who are Christians from various traditions, Jews, agnostics, others, but who are interested in spirituality and who have come together to provide some sort of an alternative, actually, of a type of not just Christian faith, but a type of religious experience which would be very familiar to those people in the 1940s, and offer some sort of an alternative, not to the religious right in schools, because I don't think religious instruction belongs in schools, but as a spiritual alternative to fill something of the vacuum you're talking about in a culture that has been fed a kind of religion which is not about religion. It's about Ayn Rand's philosophy on one hand, and it's about the takeover of power on the other hand. And so I think actually we have to really be careful to define our terms, and that is that the religious right is not about religion, it is about political power. And religion is used as a means to that end, to undermine what they regard as a secular culture which they hate on the basis of the fact that it is against them as they see it on cultural issues. And so I don't see this debate as somehow being between secularists who want values and teaching out of schools of all kinds and religious people who are trying to fill a spiritual vacuum. I see this as a battle between people who want a democracy and maintain that secular culture of a rule of law, and people who are using religion as a pawn in a power political game. That's the way I see it. So I don't really think these terms cover it accurately.
I want to add something to that. When a lot of these religious initiatives show up in public schools, people assume it's because of some kind of spontaneous desire from the community. In fact, many of these religious initiatives are organized and funded at a national level by people who are far away from the communities where these religious initiatives are showing up. So, and in fact, many of them set themselves in a sort of aggressive way against the communities in which they are intending to serve. Now, let me give you an example of that. When we were living in Santa Barbara, California, we and the Good News Club showed up in our school. It set the community afire. I mean, it ignited a minor religious war in our community. About 25 to 30% of the parents, or 25 to 50% of the parents in our school were evangelical. They got together because they didn't want the club to come into our school either. And they respectfully said to the Good News Club, look, we agree with your faith, we understand you, we know you mean well. May we move you off campus out of the public school to this evangelical church, literally next door to the school. I mean, this incredibly beautiful church. And the Good News Club leader said, no, we want to be in this school. The school is where we want to be. And that just shows how, and people were insulting each other for their faith. I mean, a Mormon friend said, can you imagine if we did this, it would be all over the national news. I mean, really, it didn't help our community. And then when I published an article in the Santa Barbara Independent about that situation, I started getting letters from people all over the country that said the exact same thing happened in their communities, where all of a sudden some little Bible study, group shows up in their public school. And as one parent said, we used to all be, parents together. And now all of a sudden you walk into the school, it's like, you're a Christian, you're the wrong kind of Christian, you're an atheist, you're a Jew, you're a Buddhist. And it fractures communities. I think if anything in our society, we need communities that function. We need public schools that function well. Public schools are the heart of each community. It's where people set aside their differences and their ethnic, their religious differences, whatever, and we all come together in support of our children because we all recognize that we all want a better world for our children. And when a religious group with a particular sectarian agenda comes in and tries to, use those public resources for their particular benefit, it does exactly the opposite of what I think most communities need.
Has a legal challenge ever been lifted against the Good News Club?
Has a legal challenge ever been lifted against the Good News Club?
Raised against the Good News Club?
No. I mean, the Supreme Court is not fond, as you probably know, of revisiting its own decisions. However, they contradict themselves all the time. For example, like this very important decision, Hosanna Tabor, just came down, I think it was last month, or 3 weeks ago perhaps, in which the Supreme Court ruled that religious groups don't need to obey the same kind of laws pertaining to discrimination in their hiring and firing. And implicit in that decision, they're saying that religion it's a special category of activity. The ministerial exception, religions can kind of do what they want. They don't have to do what other nonprofits do or private companies do. And I agree with that. Religion is special. It is in a separate category. But however, the 2001 Good News Club decision said that religion is not special. It's just free speech. It's nothing more than speech, just like any other. So I think, which is it? Is religion special, or is it just like everything else? I think there's a huge contradiction there, and I frankly wish more people would look into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think your narrative is going to run into a problem because the Second Circuit just affirmed, and the Supreme Court couldn't get 5 people to, I think it's 4 people actually, to accept an appeal of a district court ruling in this jurisdiction, in Manhattan, as a matter of fact, that churches can be barred from, services can be barred from public schools. Now, this is not evidence to me, maybe to somebody here, of some kind of overwhelming, successful conspiracy. Frank, I think if you look at you talk to the people that used to be meeting when you were in the group, they're not really being very successful these days. But it's just not happening. So why not bring that up? I mean, how many people?
I'm sorry. Can you clarify the question?
Sure. The question is are we faced with some overwhelming tide of Christianist judicial activism taking over our public schools? I think you must not be in New York very long if you think public schools are a place where people put aside their identities and kumbaya with each other.
I think you need to learn about the judicial, you need to look into the judicial advocacy, the legal advocacy groups of the religious right. Groups like the Alliance Defense Fund, Liberty Council, they have combined budgets of over $100 million a year, and they're heavily focused on promoting religious activity in public schools. They defended the Bronx Household of Faith and all the church planters. Look, in 2001, there were no churches in public schools, operating rent-free in public schools. Now there are 160. So that, to me, indicates like a huge sea change.
Except now there won't be any because the public schools can bar the religious.
Actually, there's a huge challenge to that, and in fact, Albany is going to probably vote on that this week.
Well, that's a democracy thing. That's the people voting. That's not.
No, actually, it's legislators voting. It's not the people voting. That's legislators voting.
Legislators that pass all other kinds of wacko stuff. I mean, it's not. It's what they do. They pass things.
That's legislators. Yes, they do pass things.
There's an article in yesterday's New York Times about this bill that Senator Golden has introduced to, I guess, extend the ability of churches to use the schools outside of school hours.
Yeah.
But by the same token, the city has issued a ban effective the 12th against this, and these churches have actually already looked for new space. So I'm not sure what...
Some of them are looking for new space and others are not. But if that bill passes, what effectively that means is that New York City Department of Education will be funding and managing one of the largest networks of evangelical churches in the state. I mean, think about it. There are, 73 or 93? I looked into the numbers, about 93 Methodist churches in New York City. There are 160 evangelical churches that are not paying rent or utilities in public schools. Look, it leads to an incredible complications in school communities. Listen to this. Last Friday, my kindergartner had a concert at his public school, and we were sitting on the stage, and it was a little bit crowded, and everybody was facing left. And so all the kids are shaking their instruments, and all the parents are sitting behind them, and the unofficial backdrop of the entire program is all of the signs for the church that operates rent-free in our public school. So I'm sitting, all my kid is watching the sign that he sees put out in the front door of his school every week. Please support our Taiwan mission, with pictures of cupcakes on it, and Morning Star New York Church, and then all these different Morning Star signs and all the paraphernalia from the church is actually on the stage being stored rent-free. And my son is looking at this. I mean, how long would signs for a mosque last in the same place? How much would Pizza Hut pay to be able to put its signs around the school and advertise for their goods in the school, which they're not allowed to do, by the way? So when you put churches in public schools and everybody thinks it's not really a big deal, well, for us it's a big deal because we're seeing, the church involves itself in very distinctive ways in the public school. And there are stories like this all over the place, all over the city. If you look through the court record, as I have, you read those court records, you see instance time and again when the churches, hey, they don't pay rent. They're not, and they have no respect for the public schools, because many of those churches are part of this movement, as Frank described, that don't really respect public education at all. So
The Times article yesterday says specifically churches pay the same rent as other groups to use schools.
they don't pay rent. This is what they pay. They pay a small fee to the custodians union that only covers a partial fee, $2 per classroom, $12 for the auditorium.
But what he's saying is nobody pays rent for the school.
You know what? After school groups like the soccer club or the theater club, they pay the same amount. But religion is different. It's a different kind of activity than soccer clubs.
If we were to
No, I know the distinction you're making because I actually have a copy of your op-ed from last year. But
okay.
The piece from yesterday's Times says, and it's not a quote or anything, it's just a statement in the article, churches pay the same rent as other.
They continue to call it rent. It's not rent. Call the New York City Department of Education. They do not have leases and they do not pay rent. They pay a minimal fee to the custodians union. That's not rent.
Ms. Stewart, I know that you're pushing this point, but the problem is you say that they do it rent-free as if other groups are being charged. They pay the same rate that everybody pays.
They pay us a minor fee to the custodians union. Look, I have a landlady.
They're not proselytizing. Why is this even an issue?
They do proselytize. Some of them use.
I'm saying sports clubs don't.
Exactly. Sports is a different activity. Look, partisan political groups are not allowed to operate in the schools either, because you don't want to have the Democrats, in the schools anyway. The Democrats or the Republicans.
Do the Scouts, for example, pay rent? Do they?
I don't know if the Boy Scouts are in public schools. In fact, I don't think they're allowed. They discriminate against gays and lesbians.
That are secular, that would be renting the schools as space.
Nobody they pay.
But since it seems to be my job to be the carping dissenter historian tonight, I'll just continue doing that. During Ramadan, when many Muslims fast, it's been reported in the papers. I've never witnessed this, but I've read about it. That in certain high schools in New York City, that there's a special room set aside for Muslim kids who don't want to go to the cafeteria, which I wouldn't want to do if I were fasting either. It's also been reported that in these schools that prayer happens. One of the reasons we know this is that organizations that are very odious to me with names like Stop Islamization Now has made a very big deal out of them. But I really worry that somebody that was perhaps more fair-minded than me could come to this event and say that we're as bad as they are. We're the Stop Christianization Now group. Because we find their viewpoints so distasteful, we're rallying against it. Could we possibly construct an argument where it would be both legitimate and perhaps even salutary for the school to set aside a special room for Muslim kids where they may actually pray, but at the same time and consistently argue for rules that would bar the sort of, to me, extremely troubling good news club type stuff that Kathy has described?
I just want to add one comment. I think that you have to keep refocusing on what the fundamental issue is here. What are the times we live in? We've just been in the middle of 2 wars of religion against people who began those wars by slamming airplanes into the World Trade Center to make a point about religion. This is not just any period of history. This is a period of confrontation between secular, humanistic, Enlightenment-infused democracy and fundamentalism worldwide. That's where we are. That's the moment of history we're in. This is the war we're in. So it's a war of ideas as well. And for anyone who says, oh, well, this is not such a big deal, well, you certainly have not been watching the Republican nominating process where there is a litmus test that each of these candidates either has to actually believe or pretend to believe to have any hope of becoming a presidential candidate in the year of 2012. And that's what's happening right here in this country. And it's no less of a rigorous litmus test than the mullahs in Iran would have to pass of a different theology in order to be admitted to the inner council. So the moment of history we're in is not neutral. It's not a neutral moment. This is a time of confrontation. Now, I happen to be a religious person who also has progressive views about culture and society and people and individual liberty. And as a religious person in that tradition, I want religion kept out of the public schools entirely. because religion in the public schools opens the door to a kind of confrontational process between secular democracy and the rule of law in this period of history, not in some nebulous other time or in general, but right now. And right now, I don't want special privileges for Muslims in schools. I don't want special privileges for Christians. And if our politicians want to go on television and say, well, if Barack Obama wants the insurance programs run by the Roman Catholic Church to include contraceptives, then he's anti-Catholic, so be it. Because they shouldn't be in the insurance program business or the hospital running business if they're not going to abide by the secular laws of the country we're in. Otherwise, we're headed to Iran. And so our moment of history is not neutral. And so I would just say we have to ask ourselves, which side are we on? And it's not a question of anti-religious. It's, do we want religion, politics, power politics, masquerading as religion to get into our educational system, or don't we? And if you want our no separate room, no privileges whatsoever for religion in our public schools, period, for any religion. And so it's no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in our period of history. No, I think in our period of history to give special privileges to any religious body that has political aspirations is an enormous mistake given the track record of what we have seen in the Middle East, what we see here in the United States, in terms of the democratic process of nominating political candidates, where if they, for instance, are atheists, they're told they can't run because an atheist could never be president in this climate, or if they're in a period of history. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think we're looking at this only in the context of public schools. I think we're looking at it in terms of a clash of two worldviews, and one believes in the rule of law, and the other believes in, call it Quranic or biblical principle overarching this rule, and you can do whatever you need to do to undermine that rule of law if you think it's on a collision course with your religion. That's the period of history we're in. That's why people are blowing up mosques in one part of the country and yanking their kids out of schools in another part of the country and homeschooling them. And I don't think that there's any point in glossing this over and pretending we're talking about something innocuous that doesn't actually have teeth in it. This is a tough moment of history. And so I am a religious person, but I do not believe that it benefits religion as a religious person. I don't believe that religion is benefited when it is used by the Republican Party, by hypocrites who I happen to personally know, like the Bush family, who didn't believe a word of what they were saying they believed, to garner votes. I think that's a complete corruption of religion. So in a weird way, I sit here tonight as a religious person feeling that I'm defending religion by saying it should get out of the business of politics. And that what we're really talking about in terms of the context of public schools is just one more overreach by people who are religious into the political realm, trying to bring their religious agenda to it. So I don't think special privileges should be given to religion. That's just my point of view.
Did Martin Luther King corrupt religion when he quoted the Old Testament in the March on Washington?
I don't think Martin Luther King or anybody else who quotes the scripture in any moral cause corrupts religion. But I think if after Martin Luther King had convinced a lot of Democrats that he was right, Kennedy being one of them, if they had had to pass a moral litmus test based on his theology and biblical worldview on every issue of the day, I'd have a problem with it. In other words, sure, he can appeal to his moral tradition. But since when does that become the actual agenda of a major political party in the United States of America?
I'd suggest that, what really kind of tears it is the question of whether or not the religious impulse we're talking about is theocratic or not. I mean, King wasn't a theocrat, right? Matt, do you want to say something here? Take the mic.
So I just want to make sure we're not talking past each other here, because I think that we might have a little misunderstanding. I think that, let me just see if I can paraphrase or rephrase what you were asking, which is this effort in actually an effective strategy? Well, what I feel like is missing is the evidence that this is working. It's insidious. It's horrifying. I totally got overwhelmed and worried about the future for my kids in this country. But is this the last gasps of a dying religion? Because frankly, America's getting less religious. It's a fact. And it is. The numbers, I just looked it up. There's a Pew study on the landscape of religion. People who identify as religious between 18 and 42 or something like that, is people who do not identify with a certain religion is 25%. Back in this generation, the baby boom generation, it's 16%. People are moving away from religion as a primary identity. What I think that goes to your issue, Frank, or Mr. Schaeffer, is that Frank, is that I love the work you've done. Is that religion and politics is a huge problem in the insidious way it's been used for power, but I don't see it as powerful as it was before the Bush election. I think that it's going the opposite direction. Call me an optimist. I think that humanism is going to win. And I think that exposing this is incredibly valuable and we should be paying attention to it. But I just need more data if you're going to convince me that the religious right is winning, because I haven't seen it yet.
Great. Can I say something to that? If the mic is working? No, it's not, of course. Well, if I hold the cord myself, it might work. Yeah. Hello? Oh, there we go. Thanks. This is the weirdest thing. Did you say, Matt, that you mentioned people becoming less religious since the Bush election, did you say?
I was saying the power of the religious right has waned since the Bush era.
Well, okay. Are you texting somebody? No, okay. I find that very distracting. Because we're not really talking, I don't think the issue here is whether or not a majority of the country is becoming infected with this creed. In fact, it's abundantly clear from Kathryn's work and really everything we've been talking about that we're dealing with a minority movement that amasses a tremendous amount of political power, vastly out of proportion to its numbers. And this is related, of course, to the Tea Party as well. Now, I didn't think I was going to get on my own hobby horse here, but I have to mention this. When Bush was, quote, reelected, unquote, in 2004, the whole press ran with a talking point that they got from the Christian right. Tony Perkins, for example, right? They were saying over and over again, Bush was elected by a vast outpouring of religious voters. This is what it was. It was values voters who elected Bush. Tony Perkins actually said the fight against gay marriage, I'm not making this up, was the hood ornament on the vehicle that drove Bush to re-election. Okay? All right, fine. Everybody and his brother in the press was saying this over and over again. There's not a shred of evidence to support this. Not a shred of evidence. In fact, the most precise poll of people's motivations for voting in that election put at 2% the number of people who were motivated by their opposition to gay marriage. The top issue that was motivating people then was the war in Iraq. After that, it was the economy. Okay? The point is that we have come to believe that this movement is far more populist than it really is for two reasons. One is systematic media exaggeration of their numbers. And it isn't just the Christian right, it's also the right generally. Like Glenn Beck's rally got acres more coverage than Jon Stewart's. And Jon Stewart's was like 2 or 3 times as big, right? So the right is systematically, its numbers are exaggerated by the media, and there has been election fraud in election after election that also has us thinking that these people are winning when they're not. So the problem isn't a problem of whether or not the majority will become excessively pious. I don't think that's the risk. The risk is that a subversive, anti-democratic, anti-secular movement partnered with big business will disempower the real majority.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd just like to add, and it's a small point, but there is a cyclical nature to declaring that the religious right is dead. I think that this has been happening regularly after every big or minor victory that the left has had for at least 20 years. Their numbers might be exaggerated, but this is a committed constituency who are not, fickle about their beliefs. They really believe this stuff. The numbers that I've seen showing shifts one thing that I have seen is, possibly younger evangelicals are moving away from, opposition to gay rights as their key touchstone issue. But in some other regards, they are, as politicized or more, particularly about abortion, which I think is going to remain an incredibly motivating factor for tons and tons of people. So they're not dead. I mean,
I'm not denying that at all. I'm just wondering if they're winning. That was my question. I'm not seeing it.
I think they go back and forth.
I just want to say something, and I want to get questions too, but really quickly, because I've heard something a few times, and I actually find it a little concerning. It's that the idea that it's the form of religion that I or other people object to, and I really don't think that that's true. I mean, if you read my book, you'll see that actually one of the chapters centers around an event where I found a Kabbalah center. The Kabbalah Center, I don't know if you guys know what it is, but they had created this character education program that was in my daughter's mandated third grade curriculum. And I frankly went a little bit crazy here. And I don't think it's about the form of religion. I want to tell you a story about a woman named Joanne Bell, who lived in a small town in Oklahoma, very religious town, mostly Baptist, but she was a Nazarene, self-described Christian fundamentalist. She objected to some of the privileging of the kids who were getting these Baptist teachings in their public schools, and she kind of, made complaints to the administration. They put her off. Finally, they said, if you don't like it, call the ACLU. So she thought, okay, I'm going to call the ACLU. That's what I'm going to do. And then all of a sudden, her house was set on fire, and the local fire department came and forgot to bring water. I think even in communities that are considered to be very religious, everybody says, what does it matter if this very religious community? The differences in theology are, religion is so much at the core of who people are. And people hold their beliefs very dear. And I think that, it's, in our instance, it was only because the Kabbalah Center is a minority religion that, frankly, we were able to kind of get it excluded from the schools. But I think when you do have a majority religion, it's not the fact that it's that religion. It's just that it has a sort of tacit support of the majority that becomes much harder to exclude. But I think our experience shows that it's really not the form of religion. It's any religion in particular that, is trying to use the public resources for their own particular benefit. Now I want questions. I'll shut up. Okay. Go ahead, you.
Okay, should I use the mic? Thanks. I find myself thinking about the kids. Okay, the kids that are the object of all this. And I think the religious right tries to sort of worm its way into schools wherever it can, whether it's creationism, book banning, the clubs that you talked about. And so you have parents saying, oh, I don't want my kids to read Harry Potter because it's Satanism. And I think it's often well-meaning parents but who hear this stuff from their leaders who are, like you said, Frank, trying to get the political foothold. And then they're saying, and I want those books out of the schools. I don't want anybody reading Harry Potter. I want everybody, all the kids to hear about creationism. And I think in a diverse society, what do you think about just the rights of kids to just be taught in a way that's going to help prepare them for a diverse society and not just see one side and wherever you want to go with that.
Can I comment? Do the historian things? Yeah.
Use the mic.
Yeah. Sorry, to be the historian here. I share both your confusion and your flabbergasted tone about the Harry Potter objection, but I also find myself sympathizing with the Harry Potter objectors because, of course, one of the things I do is I study textbook objections in the past, right? And up through the early 60s, one of the ways that kids in this country learned to read and write was through a textbook series called Little Black Sambo. And, Little Black Sambo, depending on who you talked to, was either Indian, but was probably African, but basically was a childlike slave or ex-slave, right? That had a good heart, but was essentially a naif and innocent. It was a profoundly, profoundly racist image and metaphor. And the Urban League and the NAACP spent a lot of time trying to, quote, censor this book. If censor means get it out of the schools. I'm not saying they're the same, but I'm saying it's more complicated than we make it. Okay? The presence of witchcraft, quote unquote, in those books is every bit as offensive to some devout fundamentalist Christians as the presence of Little Black Sambo was in those readers. And I think all of us who care about the public schools, we got to take that seriously.
actually have a couple of questions, but first to Jonathan. John, sorry. The point you were making in your presentation, I think, is something that reminds me of a phrase called the Christian left, which is that this, I think, is, as you were delineating, in the 50s and early 60s, a major bugaboo of the extreme right, like the John Birch Society. And I've seen their propaganda pamphlets about this that say, like, how red is the National Council of Churches, and so on. But on that point, I think, like, when you say Martin Luther King was a reverend, well, he was also a PhD, right? I think in sociology, is that right?
Theology.
Theology, okay. So you could sort of make the case he was, I'm sorry, I thought he was sort of an academic, though, as well. But in any case, whatever he was basically supported and scripted, if you will, by secular groups, left-wing secular groups in this country, who by default had to sort of go this quasi-religious route because they'd been smashed in the late 40s and early 50s by McCarthyism and, you know, the right-wing repression that existed in America, right?
Well, not exactly. You know, not exactly. Americans are incredibly devout. Americans are incredibly devout people, especially in cross-national comparisons. You know, I mean, our friend from Truth Out, which is an organization I have huge admiration for, is correct that the number of people that identify themselves as members of formal religious faiths has gone down slightly. Yet the comparisons, the transatlantic comparisons especially, you know, to other rich democracies in the world are really stark on all the questions. You know, do you believe in heaven? You know, do you believe in afterlife? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Satan? I mean, at some point, Google this and you'll see. I mean, it is a chasm. Americans are devout people. They were then, they are now. And that's why, frankly, as a devout Democrat, I don't want the other team to have God.
All right. In terms of who has God, this is also interesting in terms of the politicization of the religion and how things seem to have gotten twisted over the decades. Because, like you were saying about the Islamicization of the New York public school system, and there's a Stop Islamicization website and group, and that seems to be of the right. But in fact, if you look at it, and this goes also to what Frank was saying, the sort of global Islamic movement was created, and not entirely created, but mostly created, funded, and armed by the United States government. The most famous example of which is fairly well known is the right-wing Polish Canadian Zbigniew Brzezinski's National Security Advisor to Carter, Operation Cyclone, which basically created, with the help of the Saudi Arabian tyranny, the Mujahideen and the Taliban, to which Bush gave $40 million his first year in office while they were blowing up the Bamyan Buddhas, and radical Islamic movement in Indonesia that helped commit the genocide of Indonesia in 1965 to 66, and so on. So, and I guess this also is in line with what Mark was saying. These are sort of astroturf type movements, even international movements, in the sense that they don't. I question whether there's so much a authentic, organic response to secular society and humanism as something that's being artificially created, funded, brainwashing training centers and schools established, if you will, and so on. And just on last point of that, what you're saying about witchcraft and Harry Potter books, and this quote witchcraft, unquote.
That interpretation.
Okay, right.
By saying that other people do.
Well, however you want to interpret it. Again, like the anti-Islamic thing, you sort of like leaves you a bit puzzled, because a few decades ago, this would have almost been an issue for the left. Like, we've got to stop radical Islam, this feudal fascist movement created by the U.S. government. Now, I'm not saying the Harry Potter books and other such books are occultic or witchcraft endorsing, but I think, as you were implying, you have to admit clearly there is that element in those books. I mean, it's not, you don't see them blatantly writing in the text, worship Satan or something like that. But there is this sort of occultic, mystical element to it. Now, I'm not saying the book should be banned or condemned on that account, but historically, this sort of occultic, Satanist, mystical, black magic type stuff has been associated with the right and with the fascist movements. So I'd wonder if you have any comment on that.
Well, The only thing that I'd add is if you want to lose an election, just say the other team is brainwashed. Okay? Just say that, all right? I mean, just think about how dismissive that is, right? I've really reasoned and come to my view because I'm such a smart dude. The other team has the wool pulled over their eyes, okay? They haven't read and thought the way that I have. Look, you can't prove a negative, okay? All I'm saying, I'm just, I think that a faith, since we're talking about faith in democracy with a small d, means a faith in believing that people of equal goodwill and equal reason can reason from the same set of facts to extremely different conclusions. It isn't, I think the worst idea on the land right now, and it is bipartisan, is that somebody who disagrees with you is either a moron or an asshole. Okay? They're either stupid or they're morally warped. Okay? Now look, I'm not saying some people aren't those things. And somewhere, right? I mean, somewhere in hell, Timothy McVeigh is burning and he qualifies, right? But the basic democratic faith, okay, is one that we're all losing. And the concept of brainwashing is antithetical to it.
I want to add something to that because it goes back to your point. Yeah, you can't. Can I just make a point? Hold on just one sec. I want to go back to a point you made about winning and losing. I agree in one way because as I talked about like this Wild Goose Festival, I think represents more of the future of, say, evangelical young people than a lot of things that people would think of when they hear the word evangelical Christian. And these folks would vote Democrat, they would do progressive things and so forth. But when you look at the 87 freshman congressmen who obstructed the presidency of Barack Obama to the point where they were shutting down the reauthorization of the debt limit, these folks didn't come out from Mars. They came out of the heart of the Tea Party movement that, according to all polls, is about 60 to 70% in terms of the base of who those folks are, a mixture of these Ayn Rand libertarians combined mostly with the evangelical bedrock organizations that have come right through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s out of the anti-abortion movement and so forth. They have produced real results. And one of those results has been the cataclysmic stonewalling of one of the most hopeful events in American history, which has been the election of our first African-American president with a good agenda, who has, I think, been shut down on a basis of racism, religion, politics, and so forth, but with the added dimension that all those things that we were working for in the 70s and 80s actually came to pass with the takeover of the nominating process of the presidential candidates for Republicans that have to pass a litmus test. This is not a joke. This is for real. 87 freshman congressmen in the Tea Party who have managed to actually stall the United States presidency in things as mundane as reauthorizing our debt limit, making us a mockery worldwide, jeopardizing our economic recovery. These are not small points. That same movement is counting on making future voters, because they have conflated the idea of voting Republican with being a Christian. They are Sarah Palin's vision of there's the real Americans, and then there's everybody else. And that paradigm comes directly out of the heart of fundamentalist Christianity, saying there are the lost and there are the saved. And it's now been applied to politics. There are real Americans, like Sarah Palin and whoever she was talking to, and then there are all those other people. So I don't think it's a question of gaining numbers or losing numbers. I think we can right now have evidence in front of our eyes that whether the future is won or lost, quote unquote, by whatever side, right now, at this moment of history, it's a very serious thing, and it has caused our country inestimable harm. And that hasn't come out of a vacuum. It's come directly out of this movement, which is part of this ongoing project of getting into public schools, which is more about creating more Republican voters. And if it wasn't, I would just say people like the Koch brothers, who don't care about these issues, would not be funding these groups so lavishly, because really what they're interested in is the continuing demonization of everything to do with government, which includes public education, so that when people say we need to regulate your industry, whether that's oil or whether that's the financial services, they can come around and say, well, you know, we're standing against that big bad government. That's why they're pouring funds into this. So I think when you look at the evangelical movement as it's become politicized on the right, because there is an evangelical left as well, you have to understand that the reason they have the corporate backing they do is they serve a purpose. And that purpose is very clear. It's the continuing demonization of all regulatory agencies. And
Can I say something on
yeah, go ahead.
subject?
Actually, we only have time for one. Okay.
I want to make it more neutral. And the reason I want to is that I want to talk about meeting space in New York for groups. When I belonged to Unity, that sort of strange Christian movement, we met at Avery Fisher Hall. Now, the actions of that congregation did not stop the Philharmonic from playing their music, right? Now, on the Upper West Side, I've noticed there are Jewish groups sometimes meeting in Christian churches and Christian groups meeting in Jewish churches, and they don't seem to taint each other. So this, let me just finish my thought.
All right, wrap it up, okay? Because we really have to stop.
Just one more thought.
Okay.
Related to this, and that's that immigrant groups are so marginalized in this city. The only place many of them have to go is their local little religious thing. And then when they get their bearings, then they start meeting other groups and getting more into other clubs besides the religion. And they need probably, and they establish community. That's the only way they can establish community.
Okay, okay. We have to stop.
They need places to
right,
meet.
they need places to meet.
Well, you should shut him up too.
Okay.
He divides people. You divide people. And that's not right. You need to bring people together.
Okay. Well, on that note, this was okay. Quick, right?
Okay, good. Yeah, very quick. As a parent and as a school psychologist, I think that public education is double threat by this religious group, but also by the economic situation where they are defunding programs where school become boring because there are no after-school programs. Because then you have the religious group having the budget to promote their own activities, and that worries me, because this is we are talking about a school system that is in terrible deficit, and then we are attacking the public school to create these new privatization schools, private schools or charter schools, and so I think I just wanted to see if you can comment on that.
Actually, it is true that privatization goes hand in hand with this phenomenon, right? Because in a lot of these towns all over the country, they often won't even have functional sidewalks because they collect no taxes. So the only game in town is the church very often. That's where all the entertainment is. That's where people go to socialize. And there's something analogous to the way that some of the Islamist movements have succeeded in some of those other countries, where there's no social programs, there's no real public funding of anything, and you'll find that groups like the Taliban, for example, will be taking care of people. So of course they will attract a great deal of popular support, because they're picking up the slack that's been sort of created by the destruction of a proper government. Anyway. Listen, this was really a wonderful event. I want to talk about what's the matter?
There's a very important question that you should not leave here without asking.
Well, I hope it's a quick question.
It's a quick question. What are we doing about it? What are you all doing about it? You've got a limited audience here. I came an hour early because I thought this place would be jammed.
Okay.
What are we going to do? And I do mean we. What are we going to do about it?
Okay. I'll take a crack at that. Truth Out is helping us to spread the word about this book and all these books. Just the fact that this audience is not as large as it could be won't count for quite so much once we get the video of this panel out and it goes viral and many people read it. You can start by buying some of these books. This is an independent bookstore. These books are books that often won't get reviewed by the New York Times. So one of the reasons we have these events is precisely to give these authors a chance to speak. And it is really very important that you buy the books and not just come for the floor show. You know what I mean? The authors will sign their copies of these books. There's really nothing that we can do about any of these problems without informing the public about them. And that's what we're doing.
With your name to get these books.
My
No.
What?
I'm serious. No,
Clout.
you've got a very famous name.
Yeah, right.
You're not.
Okay. We'll talk later. Okay. We'll talk to my the New York
Can't
Times.
get them reviewed.
No, please. You're living in a dream world. February 20th, we're going to have David Graeber here, who is the sort of intellectual godfather of the Occupy Wall Street movement. You must come, the 99%, right, John? And we'll have a few people from NYU here with him. On March 28th, we're going to deal with the corporate university and its effect on the city. And the occasion for this panel is going to be NYU's horrific expansion plan for Greenwich Village. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. That's my employer. It's John's employer, too. And then in April, the first Tuesday in April, we're going to have an event on the wars. David Swanson will be here, and Jackson Lears, and so on. So please continue to pay attention to the bookstore's website. We'll keep announcing these panels. Spread the word about them. I want to thank our panelists. It was an excellent, excellent evening. I want to thank the audience, too. So good night.